much. My name's Alexandra Lippman. I'm a postdoc here at UC Davis with the Innovating Communication and Scholarship Project. And I'm very excited about this panel. It sort of became a two-part panel, so right after this you'll hear the second version, or sort of a reiteration of some similar themes. The topic is risks and opportunities in digital openness beyond the journal, open objects and digital things. So briefly, this panel sort of looks at how, with the digitization of material or real-world entities, what questions are raised about circulation, sovereignty, accessibility, and risks as data becomes reproducible or synthesizable. And while there are clearly benefits in terms of for scholarship or for increasing access to these materials or the ability to synthesize them, there are also certain questions or risks involved. And this panel will be we're looking at very diverse material from 3D scanning of archaeological artifacts to synthetic biology to the digitization of archival recordings. The panelists are Margot Bagley, who's a professor of law at Emory University, Maurizio Forte, professor of classical studies, art history, and visual studies at Duke University. He is also the founder and director of Dig at Lab. So he's he's a digital archaeologist, so we're very happy to have him here. And Aaron Fox is an associate professor of music and director of the Center for Ethnomusicology at Columbia University. And for this panel, Margot has to run off to the airport to get her flight at 12:45. So we're going to have her speak, her answer questions, and then she has to leave. But thank you very much, Margot.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. And I'm just delighted to be here. Special thanks to Mario for inviting me. This topic is one that, and this conference as a whole is very timely. But the particular topic I'm going to be talking about, dematerializing genetic resources, synthetic biology, IP, and the ABS bypass, it's a topic that's percolating to the surface in a number of different fora. It's always a pleasure to follow Professor Okediji, and she mentioned the WIPO IGC. That's one place where these issues are coming up, but also at the Food and Agriculture Organization, with the Seed Treaty, the CBD and Nagoya Protocol, a number of areas. And the potential for impacts on people in the global south could be quite significant. It's hard to say yet, it's early days, but a lot going on. So this has come out of a number of projects that I've been working on in this area. 2 reports for the Wilson Center, one in 2013 and one in 2015, looking at the Nagoya Protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and in particular, its impacts for synthetic biology researchers, the vast majority of whom, as far as I can tell, are unaware of the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. And then that one was with Artie Rai from Duke University, Todd Kukin at the Wilson Center, who's now at NC State, asked me to do a follow-up report. Unfortunately, Artie was unable to join me, but that was drilling in a little deeper, digital DNA, looking at the use and potential misuse of digital information, its relation more to intellectual property, and some other treaties, the IGC treaty treaties that are being negotiated, again, as Professor Okediji mentioned. And now I'm in the midst of another project with Todd and Eric Welch from Arizona State University, and this is for the FAO, International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. So another place where an acronym is very helpful, though that acronym isn't terribly helpful, so we just call it the Seed Treaty or the Plant Treaty. And this treaty is interesting. It's an agreement under the CBD that just deals with these genetic resources that are being used for this particular purpose and tries to reduce transaction costs. Countries put their material into the multilateral system. Anyone who wants to use it can. There's a standard material transfer agreement. And if you commercialize anything, you're supposed to put 1.1% of what you make on the product into this benefit sharing fund. So that's, but unfortunately, people aren't really putting any money in. And then with the digitization of material, the treaty's starting to wonder, well, how's that going to impact? Is that going to make it even harder for us? So we actually have been going around doing interviews with a lot of synthetic biology researchers and trying to find out how people are actually using material and data. And we'll be developing a report and presenting that later this year, but it's really fascinating. So what is synthetic biology and how does it differ from regular biology? One researcher I talked to said, well, it's really just molecular biology with better PR. And that's one view. The views are really quite different. There is no single definition, but as near as I can tell, it's more of a mindset. It's a way of thinking about biology as more of an engineering discipline, that you can develop standardized parts like Lego bricks that you can interchange and come up with new functions and get organisms to do different things. But it's applying this engineering mindset, and that's really what makes it different. Lots and lots of things are going on. Some elements are entirely novel, but folks are constructing parts, constructing systems, and the pace of change is dramatic. One of the things you might have heard about is expanding the genetic alphabet to include additional nucleotides, X and Y, creating a new base pair, which theoretically could lead to the development of new proteins and possible new cures. That's an example of revolutionary synthetic biology. Some synthetic biology projects are aimed at mimicking nature, and so Pembient is a startup, and it's interesting, this combines synthetic biology and 3D printing. 3D printing rhino horn, and it's a conservation mechanism. The idea is that if we can make fake rhino horn that is genetically identical, looks the same, and flood the market with that, then people will not have the incentive to poach and kill rhinos in the wild. So lots of things that folks are working on. Vast array of uses. There are plenty of companies that are working on chemical synthesis replacement. Instead of using petrochemicals, you can perhaps get yeast, coaxed yeast to produce a variety of industrial products and flavorings. Gene drives, very controversial, but lots of potential as well. Biomining, you've heard about CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing that can be used in a wide range of applications. Lots of money is being poured into synthetic biology. In the early years, the majority was coming from DARPA, not surprisingly, defense concerns about bioengineering. But more recently, we are seeing lots of Silicon Valley companies investing, over 400 in the last report, $1 billion in the past 12 months invested in synthetic biology. The research has the red shows a lot, because you can't actually see the numbers, lots of companies and universities and researchers doing synthetic biology, East Coast and West Coast of the United States. The next larger numbers would be the ones in yellow, and then the smallest numbers would be in blue. But it is expanding across the globe with more and more entities engaging in synthetic biology research across a range of products. And not just products for commercial purposes, so that's certainly a big part of it, but lots of different purposes. Evolva is a somewhat controversial company that is trying to create get yeast to produce various high-value products like saffron and vanillin and stevia, and using synthetic biology for that. Now, interestingly enough, synthetic biology is area where you have a lot of do-it-yourselfers as well, which creates to the notion of openness and open access. There are community labs where you can do synthetic biology, and there is a big competition, IGEM, the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition, takes place in Boston every year, and it started out with something like 10 or 11 teams. It's grown to 300 teams. Todd is involved with it. He gave me these slides. It's amazing. And I was able to talk to one of the UVA teams about IP, but again, it's not just the United States. We have, oh, and that shows where the teams have come from. This is a team from Peru. So Global South, we've got all kinds of folks. And at IGEM, the teams tend to be college students, but they also have some high school teams as well. And with IGEM, it has a registry of standard biological parts. This is a combination of tangible genetic material that's being put into these registries, as well as sequence information that pretty much anyone can access and use, so again, very open. And not just for IGEM, but this is happening, researchers everywhere are putting their samples, their sequences into these repositories or databases. Growing your own materials. This was a class you could have gone to in New York a month or so ago, designing materials, growing materials to wear, okay, that you could turn into outfits. And people are using crowdfunding as well to raise money for their synthetic biology projects. All right, so patents are the primary form of protection for synthetic biology inventions, but there's a real tension in the synthetic biology community because you have this notion of openness, of do-it-yourself. Let's get these registries. And there's this open source ethos, but there is still a recognition that sometimes you need protection. And so there are some folks that will make their sequences publicly available, and they will then choose to patent particular inventions that they've come up with. There are some challenges in the United States in particular, and Australia as well, because of the Myriad Genetics case that while the case basically said that you can't patent genomic DNA, it also said you can't patent synthetic DNA if it isn't markedly different to what exists in nature. And there actually have been some rejections in the patent office on synthetic biology applications where the sequences are too short. But they generally have been able to overcome those objections. So patenting is the primary form of protection. Folks have tried to obtain copyright protection. So far, the Copyright Office has rejected requests to register DNA sequences. And that's where we get to challenges with the Global South, that people are patenting things, whether it's sequences or the actual tangible material, and that material came from somewhere. Okay? And so for a long time, there have been concerns about ethnobiological research and biopiracy, with biopiracy generally relating to patenting plants, genes, things that you get from nature, often that folks were led to by people in a country, indigenous group members, and then not sharing the results or the benefits with the holders of the knowledge and the conservers of the material. And it doesn't always involve it doesn't always involve patents. I've got a couple of stories there from recent expeditions where people go get things and they're not necessarily patenting, but it's still a problem. We've got researchers at different universities who've been accused of biopiracy for the research that they've done and getting patents on it. But of course, the concern is when people really start making money, okay? It's not just that you're doing research, but when you're commercializing. There's an example there, a drug, Bristol-Myers Squibb produces it for breast cancer, and it was developed from a microbe obtained from a soil sample in, I think it was, South Africa. So these concerns contributed to the need for the treaty called the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has been in effect since 1993. Basically, every country on Earth is a party to except the United States. We signed, then Senate never ratified. And it has some basic principles that states basically have sovereign control over the biological resources within their border. They should endeavor to make access available, but it should be on mutually agreed terms with prior informed consent. It did not exactly say how to do that, and so some years later, we have the Nagoya Protocol to the CBD, which provides a framework for access and benefit sharing, and has a number of important innovations in it. It has an ABS clearinghouse. It makes it easier to find who in a country you need to contact if you want to get permission. It has lists of monetary and non-monetary benefits that can be used for sharing. It obligates parties to work with each other if there have been violations of a country's laws relating to the Nagoya Protocol. So all of that is important. One of the things that Nagoya also established was, or it has included, is Article 8 on non-commercial use, to make it easier for people to engage in non-commercial research and limited restrictions on access for if you're doing it for non-commercial purposes. It's a little ironic that that was one of the least controversial provisions because that's creating some problems now. We've got lots of non-commercial research going on in various countries, and we've got sequencing of information going on, the information being put into databases that are publicly accessible and then being used for commercial purposes. So that's bypassing the access and benefit sharing system that the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol and the Seed Treaty as well envision. And that's causing some countries to be more resistant to making access available. I'm not going to talk about that. So yes, this digitization, we're seeing more and more sequences in public databases. Biology is being digitized. That was Craig Venter. There are lots of software tools that make it relatively easy to do this, to design your own sequences, and then send them off to a foundry that will turn that typed sequence into actual material and send it back to you. And oftentimes there's no need now for the tangible starting material. Some researchers still want to start with the material, do the sequencing themselves. We're seeing a wide range of uses but there are some researchers who's like, we never use the tangible material. We just use the sequence information. And we go to GENBANK or we go to NCBI or EdGene or wherever. We get sequence information. We find sequences that are going to perform the particular function we want, and we start putting them together. So a lot of that is happening, and that's raised the concern of digital biopiracy. This is Jim Thompson from ETC Group, and that was 2014, the first meeting of the parties to the Nagoya Protocol, giving out the Synbio Award to Evolva. And I should mention, one of the concerns with Evolva that implicates the Global South is one of the things that Evolva says with their various products, the vanillin, the stevia, the saffron, is they'll be able to call it natural, okay? They're basically modifying yeast to produce these products, and the yeast and the modified genes won't end up in the products. And there's a real concern that they're going to be putting farmers in the Global South out of jobs. So the economic impacts really quite significant for people who often don't have a social safety net. So farmers, vanilla farmers in Madagascar, for example. So there's a lot of concern about that aspect of synthetic biology as well. And the fact that, as Evolva says, they can produce products that are going to taste more like the natural product than you can actually get from the petrochemical production today. All right, so this might sound somewhat familiar, this digital biopiracy. It's very similar, at least in my mind, to illegal file sharing or downloading. The same problem that we had with digitization, that you can copy things easily, and you're going to have high quality of the copies, and you're not going to have to pay the creator or the originator for what you are now copying and using, and that reduced sales of albums, and we can expect further reductions in access and benefit sharing, or the benefit sharing part of ABS, as genetic material is digitized, and this is something that countries are concerned about. Where it differs to the file sharing scenario is those products, the movies, the music, they're protected by IP. And it can be not too difficult to figure out, oh yeah, that's actually a copy. Raw genetic material is generally not protected by intellectual property. The owners, the sovereigns, are far more diffuse and diverse, and hard to detect what's being copied if you're taking a sequence from this particular organism. A lot of researchers tell us, well, I could find it here, but I could also find that same sequence in a different organism. Hard to do watermarking. Watermarks can often be identified and then stripped out. So there's some real problems right now with being able to track and being able to find out if someone is actually using a sequence. And a lot of the projects involve combinations of sequences from a lot of different species. So these researchers produced morphine precursors using genes from a variety of different poppies, a rat, a bacterium, and again, create a new sequence, putting it all together, insert it into yeast, feed the yeast lots of sugar, and that has other ecological implications, and produce these products. This is a patent. I believe, involve a patent, Synbio production of steviol glycosides. So this is stevia, the non-calorie sweetener. But there are 30 different possible species that they're using, that sequences from, to come up with this synthetic stevia. And they're getting sequences from publicly available databases and putting sequences into databases. This is from the patent. It says the sequence is available in GENBANK. Oh, no, that one said that you could get it from here, there, and everywhere, lots of different organisms. This one says, the sequence is available in a publicly accessible database in GENBANK. And another challenge is that in some cases, Global South researchers are the ones who are putting the sequences in the databases. And I know I'm running, okay, all right. And it's a part of the research, which is really good that they're doing, but if you want to publish in Science or Nature Biotechnology or Current Microbiology, you have to make your sequence information available. So they put it on GENBANK, which is run by the NIH, and anybody can then access it. So this is a gene sequence from a honeybee from Iran, and there it goes in GENBANK, okay? So this is a challenge. And another challenge is that people are trying to make the sequence data and the material even more open. So BioBricks has developed an open MTA. It's still in draft form, and the goals are good. Material transfer agreements can be really problematic. We've talked to a number of researchers who sometimes aren't able to do their research because the terms of a material transfer agreement are too onerous. People want reach-through rights. And so BioBricks is like, we can make so much progress with curing diseases and feeding the world if people could easily get access to the material that they need and the data that they need. And so the BioBricks Open MTA, it basically, if you compare it to other MTAs, the Uniform Biological Material Transfer Agreement, it basically gets rid of all of the limitations. You can share this material with whoever else you want. You can commercialize it. You can get patents on it. Anybody can use it. It's basically, and one of the things they say is it's better than no MTA, because oftentimes with no MTA, the UB MTA is kind of the default, and that has these various restrictions. But one thing that struck me and if you go to the BioBricks website, they've got a nice little video and talks about how wonderful this is and how we can save the world, basically, if we do this. I'm like, they're treating the material and the information like it's a common heritage of mankind. Okay, no recognition really of the rights of sovereigns in relation to this genetic material. It starts from the researcher who can freely give it away. And I know it's something that the folks at BioBricks are struggling with. They're aware of the CBD in Nagoya, and it's a complicated issue, but it's a challenge. And it's something to think about that and it goes back to what Professor Okedeji said, that in this effort to make things more open, it hurts the people who probably need that the most. So not sure what, these are all problems or challenges in relation to synthetic biology. There's another question, whether the treaties that I've been talking about actually cover intangible genetic information. They were all developed at a time when people were focused on tangible material. And it's not clear, okay? What is clear is that the treaties themselves are a floor and not a ceiling, and do not constrain what national governments can do in terms of claiming ownership over information. So if you take Brazil, for example, their law says that ABS requirements apply to information of genetic origin. And I got this slide from a presentation by a Brazilian researcher, and it's very explicit. Use of information from genetic sequences published in public databases, GENBANK, okay, is covered by Brazil. So if you are using a sequence from Brazil, then you should be sharing the benefit. You should have some sort of access and benefit sharing agreement with the government of Brazil. But again, how do you track that? How do you, GenBank doesn't require disclosure of origin. And Professor Okedeji mentioned that in the IGC, we're dealing with these disclosure of origin issues, trying to get an agreement where people will disclose the origin of the genetic resources that they use in coming up with their inventions that they're then trying to obtain patent protection on. But it's much more challenging when we're talking about sequence information, and especially when we're talking about the fact that this sequence, the synthetic sequence, might have come from multiple, might have sequences from multiple organisms. All right, I've got to end. So, oh yeah, that's really interesting too. So the bottom line is, no, there's a Brazilian iGEM team, and they came up with this new gene, and they're like, we want to use this for our iGEM team. They asked Todd, because Todd's one of the iGEM people, and he's like, yeah, and he sent me this message. He's like, this is just what you're talking about. I'm like, yeah. I mean, so this Brazilian genetic patrimony is going to go into the iGEM registry, okay, and it's going to be free for anyone to use. You know, the Brazilian government, I'm sure, is not going to be, but, okay. So bottom line is synthetic biology, there's a lot of promise here, a lot of potential for improved quality of life for many people. There is this democratizing factor that could be of benefit to folks in the global south, to countries who can actually take advantage, especially if they start doing more of the sequencing themselves, and that's something that we're really starting to see could be quite valuable. Digital information, it creates new ways of sharing benefits as well, and the possibility of more capacity building. I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but if someone wants to ask, we can talk about that in the brief Q&A. And these treaties don't clearly address it. The negotiators don't really know what to do yet. It's going to take a while to figure that out. And in the meantime, we're going to see various national laws that are going to govern this, and researchers may be subject to laws that they don't know anything about and that can create problems for them. So we need to try to work towards a win-win scenario. What that exactly looks like, I don't know, but I hope we get there. Thank you. I should come here and sit down. Okay. No questions?
So I think the point was we could
So,
briefly take a question or two, maybe
before she runs.
before Margot has to run. But are there questions?
I'm like, oh, I explained everything so clearly. Yay. No.
Jonathan was going to have a question.
This is both a comment and a question. I'm Jonathan Eisen from Davis. So after reading the reports from the Wilson Center, and I've been involved in genomics for many years, I worked at Tiger with Venture, and sailing around the world, sequencing the ocean. We tried to get him to sample only in international waters, by the way, but that didn't work. So I have a question more about the practicality of what to do now, which is that I was involved in a project where samples were collected by someone from another country that we generated sequence data here for, and we basically decided that we didn't quite have permission from the right players associated with this project to do anything with the data at this point. And in part, that was worries about the loss of control over their genetic resources and sort of not having any framework to deal with this. So do you have like recommendations for the interim for where to go in these processes, like with the, like putting up some license like the Brazilian government did with what they want people to do with the data, or not depositing it into GENBANK, or what to do for now?
Right. So that's a good question, and we're still trying to figure out with this next report we're doing whether we're actually going to even make recommendations. I think we will make some recommendations, but probably. So the Nagoya Protocol, the clearinghouse, it says where you can go to get permission. But if you're saying that you went to someone to get permission and they said no, then that's a problem. And putting the sequence in GenBank is definitely.
Yeah, we got permission. We just feel uncomfortable, basically, with the informed consent part of the permission, because it seems like the technology has outrun the general protocols.
Okay, yeah, and that is a problem. Even one of the things we're seeing as well is there may be an access and benefit sharing agreement, and it's not a well-drafted agreement, and it still doesn't actually provide very much protection. So as an ethical operator, then yeah, not putting the sequence in GenBank, understanding the concerns seems like that would be a reasonable approach. But at the same time, if you're doing research and you want to publish an article in relation to that, it's like it's almost it really is a catch-22. And I must say I don't have a good solution. I mean, on the one side it's don't put it in there, and the other side it's like, but wait, we're trying to, this is valuable information that people need to know about, but. And we have permission. We actually have permission, but do we have permission for this? Okay, so you probably don't have permission for that. Is anyone going to actually come after you? Probably not. But that's the struggle.
Yeah.
So maybe one more question. Mackenzie has her hand.
Yeah, so following on that question, I'm thinking about scientific reproducibility, right? Just in addition to the ethical issues of sharing, it's not scientific if nobody can reproduce it, but there are certain areas of research where they've developed protocols like human health, where HIPAA, kind of protects data and really sets the bar pretty high for getting access to it. So maybe the issue is that you do want it in a place where it is accessible by researchers who have kind of verified what they want it for, but not, so I'm just making this up as I go along, but you know what I mean, like come up with a framework where it's semi-private.
Right. And that is, I'm glad you mentioned that. That is another possibility, that there is some sort of barrier to access to the data. Right, it's available, but if you're going to access it, you perhaps agree to continue in terms of disclosing the origin and the limits on how it can be used. And these are things that countries need to be involved in setting up as well, or at least what those protocols should look like, what they want. But yes, that would be that might be the happy medium between putting it in GenBank and anybody can access it, and not putting it out there at all. Yeah. So, thank you.
Alexandra, your call.
All right, it's 11:30. Okay. Thank you so much. So this is Professor Aaron Fox.
Ovlaluktuk Inuit. That's a greeting from the global north. The irony of my presence here, which would be funny to Inupiaq people, is that while nominally representing a perspective from the global south, the work, I work all over the place, but the project that I draw the most from in this work is a long-term ethnographic repatriation I've been doing on the Arctic coast of Alaska for the last decade. And last night it snowed over half a foot there, so good morning, Inuits. And I won't come back to this in the paper, but just as a tease, I constantly, and with approval from several Inupiaq elders, refer to the Inupiaq Eskimo and Inuits in general as the original open source culture. It's worth thinking about. So I'm going to read something. It's odd for me to primarily read sort of framing and introductory material from a longer paper I'm working on that mostly thinks through, as I tend to do, a series of ethnographic examples drawn from over a decade of repatriation work of the kinds of problems that face on a really granular, practical level the contemporary archivist in encounters with very different and compelling kinds of collaborations with indigenous colleagues and activists and artists and communities. So I'm going to read something that's more framing and doesn't go into the stories, which requires me to read. Which is actually good because the stories can get into digression. For the past 15 years or so, I have managed a collection of field recordings of traditional music from all over the world, made mostly by the mid-century American music collector Laura Bolton. I meant to flash this on my thanks and gratitude page. And also, actually, before I get rolling, this woman just died. Her name is Myrtle Lakutchuk. She's one of the great dancers of the Inupiaq community. Died literally a few days ago and just had a funeral. So I do this in memory of Myrtle. There's Laura Bolton, who sold, along with what she asserted were associated intellectual property rights, a large collection of recorded traditional music she had made since the late 1920s. In the mid-1960s is when she sold it to my university. Working with a broad range of mostly indigenously identified collaborators, I got some more Bolton slides to entertain you. That's her working in Alaska. Indigenously identified collaborators, students, activists, and artists, I've sought to, quote, repatriate, the word is a problem, significant portions of these recordings with major projects in the Alaskan Inupiat, Arizona, Hopi, and Navajo, Diné, British Columbia, Tsimshian, and also non-Native American, but African American and Appalachian communities, as well as lots of smaller repatriation projects in other settings. The idea of repatriating indigenous recordings was emergent when I began, just starting to take hold of my generation of archivists. And those of us who pioneered the practice drew heavily on models derived from the influence of NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, on museums and archives holding physical objects and human remains, alongside a similarly emergent set of practices in the repatriation of visual culture, photographs and films and the like. Much of this effort was enabled, driven, and necessitated by a digital turn in the media archiving business and by the concurrent rise of a discourse, mostly utopian and progressive, of opening access to previously restricted or physically fragile colonial archives, especially in university collections. Itself part of a larger movement to open access to scientific publications, research products, and data sets that is the larger frame of this very meeting today. For those of us who work with indigenous communities especially, the value of archives for supporting efforts to revitalize or retain endangered languages and fragile cultural traditions, and especially the appeal of digital media to young people, for whom such legacies were of critical importance in the present, motivated a wave of efforts to open up access to archives for indigenous communities in particular. My own repatriation work and that of my colleagues in ethnomusicology which I should say is like musicology but with a worse name, to put on, was further stimulated, actually it's more like anthropology with a worse name, was further stimulated by a sense that digital circulation was a tsunami that would sweep up complex archival objects in commercially exploitative and decontextualizing explosions of circulation that we could only try to shape and not resist from the position of the academic archive. In ethnomusicology, this anxiety was abetted by a recent history of, and literature that developed around this, written by Steve Feld and Hugo Zemp, Steve was my teacher, of world music, a commercial genre that drew heavily on reified sampling of traditional cultural expressions, often drawn or even stolen directly from ethnomusicological archives and recordings, scholarly recordings. Similar effects could be observed in other markets for indigenous and traditional cultural products and expressions, from paintings to medicines to spiritual knowledge. Over the years, these are repatriation pictures. They're indirectly related to what I'm talking about. This is an Inupiaq rapper who samples her grandfather's songs for beats and raps in the Inupiaq language. Akumatu is her performing name. And similar effects could be observed in these other markets for other kinds of indigenous cultural products and expressions. Over the years I've been doing this work, I have come to a much more problematized and complicated understanding of what is at stake in imagining the colonial archive as a site of social justice. In many ways, despite a long list of successful projects and emotionally powerful experiences, and there is nothing more satisfying for me than the feeling of reconnecting people with the voices and images of their ancestors. It's why I got into this. The first time it happened, I was hooked for good. I have soured on the language of repatriation as such, and a mythos of liberal idealism that in many ways sustains a colonial dynamic, even in an age of repatriation. In particular, I have been influenced in this thinking by young Native scholars and artists who have interrogated the relationship between the ethnographic archive and the constraints of, quote, identity within which they are forced to participate or compelled to participate in their indigeneity and practice their indigeneity in order for it to be recognized as authentic, including within academic spaces. I will offer here for the remainder of my few minutes a broad critical view of repatriation projects undertaken in recent years by activists and ethnomusicologists, myself included, many collaboratively with me, working with archives of recorded sound collected from indigenous artists and communities over the course of the 20th century under a wide range of rubrics, but always with the notion that the collectors, like Laura Bolton, were, quote, salvaging something traditional or pre-modern that would otherwise be lost to history, to science, and to the advance of civilization. A quality partially defined, which you can now see totally related to this idea of the public sphere and the public domain, right? This idea of a civilizational good in retaining the traces of people who have been wiped out in a process that calls itself civilizing, right? So that irony right there. A quality partially defined by a systematization and institutionalization of record keeping, of which the modern sound archive is a minor branch. Even when the work of repatriation, itself a problematically gendered and nationalistic term, is focused, as it usually is, on laudable applied goals, and here's a list of them: reuniting families and communities with precious memories, recovering detailed knowledge of poorly documented archival recordings, providing teaching materials for educators working to sustain indigenous languages and lifeways, creating new sources for contemporary indigenous artists to develop, establishing consultative and culturally appropriate usage policies, traditional knowledge licensing, on and on. In the present, the turn toward repatriation and a broader and commendable ethics of activism, historical accountability, collaboration, and reciprocity in ethnomusicological work suggests we are finally launched on an emerging historical critique of our fields, my fields, long-standing interdependence with militarism and colonialism, and in its relationship to a broader colonial politics of science and research, in this case especially the anthropological construction of non-Western otherness as a locus of theoretical explanation, as a technology of power. It is, of course, a long way from the post-colonial critique to a decolonized practice, and my field, ethnomusicology at least, is just beginning to travel. We are in early stages relative to some of our adjacent fields in museum studies and anthropology even. Scholars such as Jonathan Stern, John Troutman, Ana Maria Ochoa, Erica Brady, and others have shown a long, direct line of influence, patronage, and institutionalization connects the history of recording, presenting, recomposing, publishing, and the predicative act of, quote, collecting Native American music and folk music more broadly in the early 20th century, the relationship of that to a later Cold War context in which contemporary ethnographic ethnomusicology, the generation of the discipline that shaped my work, my earlier work, emerged in its current institutionalized American form, in part through a reification of the earlier 20th century archive as ahistorical cultural data, and the construction of intellectual lineages connecting what was called comparative musicology in 19th and early 20th century Germany, vergleichende Musikwissenschaft, to American anthropology in the mid-20th century at my university, at Columbia primarily, under Franz Boas and his student George Herzog, who was the main importer of European comparative musicology into American ethnographic anthropology. Scholars such as my own teacher, Stephen Feld, Phil Bowman, David Novak, who's my student, Georgina Bourne, have helped us to conceptualize that recordings and all music under a schizophonic, that's Feld's derivation of a term from Murray Schafer, a splitting of sound from its source, the possibility of a recording being in a different place from the moment of sound that it captures, so schizophonia, right? Scholars such as Feld, Bowman, Novak, and Bourne have helped us conceptualize that recordings and all music under a schizophonic episteme of global mass mediation in the era of recording are located in networks of interpretation, webs of meaning, and are no more neutral images of a stable reality, no more data in the abstract than a photograph or a film or a painting. The act of listening to recorded music is as fundamentally social as performing music in co-present social interaction. Every intentional sound or image emerges in a context of historical social relations. It can only be removed to another context of historical social relations. It cannot be stripped of its sociality without being stripped of its significance. Scholars such as Jane Anderson and Kim Christian have helped us to conceptualize the political and epistemological dimensions of the contemporary encounter between indigenous communities and people and the archives and museums and publications that contain, control, index, preserve, disseminate, and too often own traces of their ancestral heritage, often situated in radically decontextualized interpretive frameworks. That's a nice way of saying fundamentally wrong metadata, yet often containing vital cultural resources for the sustenance of languages and traditions that are on the verge of passing away, and the remembrance of elders and community histories. Not always on the verge of passing away. It's actually a key point that the rhetoric of the dying culture that sustained all this collecting was 99% bullshit. Excuse my language, we're on web broadcast. So often situated in these decontextualized contexts. Anderson and Christian, in particular, have shown us how competing conceptions of the publics that are served by, quote, science, and the archives that support science collide as archives and museums and scholars increasingly open up public access to their collections and take advantage of digital modes of circulation and publication, perpetuating a historical cycle of alienation of indigenous frameworks for circulation and ownership that began when these collections were first aggregated as data in the first place for the study of abstractions such as primitive culture. As Kim Christian has written, and I think I have this on a slide, yes, collecting institutions' core commitments to access predicated upon openness to the public severely limits the possibility of seeing indigenous claims as alternative types of openness, access differently conceived. Oftentimes in these situations, indigenous systems of information management are defined as cultural values or tradition. In either case, while collecting institutions may be sympathetic to these concerns, they do not see them in the same semantic light as the assumed universal claims on which their assertions of a uniform typology for access are based. Posit say, on the other hand, this massive publication and circulation and distribution and database proliferation has provided the point of entry and access for so many indigenous people and communities, I've lost track in my own practice alone, the value of having a little bit of information out there that ends up finding the great-granddaughter of somebody who recorded for Laura Bolton in 1933. So I want to bracket that point, but I don't want to barrel down the road without acknowledging it. While I do not have time, obviously, to pursue the broader history of the Colonial Archive as a categorical and disruptive problem for a contemporary discourse of open access, obviously that's my larger point, to the resources of academic science, my goal here is to situate my own practice and experience as an archivist and heir to this indelible legacy, to think through the ways power and privilege continue to inhere in the archival object, the data of an earlier scientific era, the property of an institutional entity, and the heritage, itself an propertizing word, of communities recovering from centuries of genocide, or more correctly, in the ways we understand, locate, interrogate, ontologize, and hear archival sound recordings in relation to our own subjective identities, the interpretive moves, as Steve Feld calls it, we, and I include myself, make to locate ourselves within ontologies, discourses, and categories still redolent of genocide, from which we cannot escape the indigenous, right? We cannot escape simply by acts of intentional will or dialectical reasoning. When I proposed this talk a while back, John Berger, the British Marxist art critic and novelist, had just died. And like many of my generation, I'm sure lots of people here are younger than me, I hope, know Berger's 1973 book version of his BBC television series, Ways of Seeing, which I was moved to mention in the paper because this practically introduced me to the idea of a social analysis of aesthetics when I was a mere lad. His work seems almost obvious now, certainly more summary than original with hindsight, channeling Benjamin, McLuhan, and Sontag, and explaining what we might call the implication of the gaze in generating modern understandings of how to read images and decode signs. In a nutshell, Berger showed or synthesized how the conventions of Western artistic realism, most especially perspective, were constituted as aesthetic and technical dimensions of fine art, and via the mechanics of patronage as a reification of the point of view of the propertied male, at first of the aristocracy, and then of the rising bourgeoisie and the colonialist. Masterpiece works of Western oil painting were in fact meant to reflect the idealized gaze of patrons who commissioned them, rich men of property, a view of the world in which they, individually as a subject, stood at the center, neutrally observing. Summarizing, it helps to make a simple point, resonant as it is with the work I've mentioned above about listening to archival recordings. Actually, go back to that. The very qualities that render them archival, the surface noise from historical media like aluminum or acetate discs, the rigors undertaken to collect them, the prices paid or values assigned to them as the insurable property of their collectors or the tax-exempt property of their collectors. I said this earlier, I forget to whom, but a Navajo elder once said to me, you know what nonprofit is? That's white men for nice house, nice car, nice office, and no taxes. I had to admit, she had a point. So the qualities that render recordings archival make them valuable to archives and universities or as scientific assets. The quality or rarity or singularity in ontological crisis from the very inception of recording as a technique, and now the predominant condition of rare recordings in an age of trivial cost burdens to duplication or circulation. What does it mean to have a rare recording, right? Are qualities that have accreted historically to the archival recording in the service of a broader ontology of the archive as a site of the disinterested gaze. It is a telling fact that we lack the oral equivalent, though we do have Stern's neologism of audile technique, right? A way of listening, a listening equivalent of the gaze, out from a neutral center. The ethnomusicological sound archive was conceived, built, and sustained as an investment in the audile technique of colonial practice, in other words. And again, these aren't my thoughts. I'm summarizing work, especially from my colleague Ana Maria Ochoa, in a book called Orality, recently out, Kofi Agawu, Stephen Feld again, and Michael Tausig. Somewhere I had book covers, I thought, yeah. In a pair of recent publications of my own, paper entitled Repatriation as Reanimation Through Reciprocity, and another called The Archive of the Archive, I have delved into the particular history of one such archival collection. The recordings, as I said, made by Laura Bolton in the first half of the 20th century, partially released on commercial discs in the 50s, sold as a collection in the 60s to Columbia, as a key asset for what was then a new PhD program in an emerging field of ethnomusicology, and then permanently loaned by Columbia to the U.S. Library of Congress, and then shared since Bolton's death and under the terms of her estate with Indiana University's Archive of Traditional Music. right? It's all over the place. In those papers, I have traced this complex, convoluted history of the acquisition and framing of the original recordings by Bolton, often made under conditions that cannot possibly be seen as equitable with her often indigenous subjects. Her formulation of their unity as a collection under her ownership and authorship and suitable for sale, my university's acceptance of these claims to acquire the recordings with the hidden motive, it turns out, of enticing a major financial gift from Bolton's elderly romantic partner, then the oldest living alumnus of Columbia University and a multimillionaire architect, and the subsequent division of his collection and its value, including ongoing royalties from her Folkways recordings, among the three current institutions holding rights in the collection. I have shown in some detail in these papers, which I can show you the sites for, how Western legal concepts of authorship and ownership and access to disempowered communities and their resources shape what might be understood as a history of appropriation, or more provocatively of theft or of intellectual and cultural property from indigenous communities and artists who lack the historical power to challenge such transformations of their cultural productions for the microphones and cameras and notebooks of collectors or researchers or tourists who came to their communities or bought Indians to their own to dance and sing for cameras and recording devices. I have shown how abstractions like the idea of a collection came to replace indigenous conceptions of the nature of songs and dances within their own particular cultural worlds, and emphasize the expectations of reciprocity and benefit that might have obtained in Bolton's encounters with Navajo and Inupiaq performers she recorded in 1933 and 1946, respectively. Almost done here. I've been involved in extensive collaborative work to recontextualize Bolton's indigenous recordings as documents of indigenous modernity, not as something salvaged from a vanishing tradition. Working with my colleague Chia Sakakibara at Oberlin in Environmental Studies, we have reconstructed a rich picture of the Inupiaq Eskimo community in Barrow, Alaska at the moment that the collector Laura Bolton passed through town to record for 2 weeks, and reconnected her recordings to the contemporary life of that community and its contemporary musical creativity in very substantial ways, offering alternative historical perspectives on the recordings themselves to the assertion that they represented anything like a vanishing musical culture. My most recent essay, The Archive of the Archive, pursues a critical legal archaeology of transactional histories around these recordings. Who got paid? How much? For what? How ownership of the collection was asserted, recognized, rewarded, acquired, described, and transferred among institutions. My current work now focuses on the conditions under which Bolton recorded at the 1933 Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago, when she stayed in a hotel room and went down to the fair to record hundreds of Indian songs. Tough field work, right? And where she made documents of Hopi, Navajo, Winnebago, and Mojave songs, along with Francis Densmore and George Herzog, for those who know this history, under Indians performing under appalling conditions for throngs of tourists. Last paragraph here. These sorts of perspectival shift, a listening past the noisy surface that distances, a willful pulling of the recordings into a present context, a retelling of their genealogies of origin and circulation are intended to re-signify the recordings, in some cases well known, in other cases rarely heard or studied. The point for me is that repatriation is not simply a transfer of sound objects and documents or of intellectual property rights and control over access and publication, nor simply the redocumentation of archival recordings with deeper contextual knowledge gained through collaborative ethnography, although it is all of those things. I'll leave up what else it is. Although it is all of those things as well, it is a fundamental challenge to the ontology of the archival sound recording, the notion that it emerges or emerged long ago from a field in which the recordist is not a participant except incidentally, a landowner surveying his or her own possessions. That was the gaze, the Audal technique that constituted our archives and founded our discipline. The world was there to listen to. The recording represents the creative intention of the recordist to take possession of a sound. We are the inheritors of that history. This is a picture of my adoptive Inupiaq brother who was shot dead by a policeman last year. And the paper actually centers on that story, so that's why it's the last slide. His name was Pamiuk Nagiak. Thank you very much. Kwenukpak. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for introduction. So my My work is a bit different from other speakers in this session, and I guess the last session yesterday. I'm an archaeologist working in the digital domain since 1985, more or less. And so today I try to focus my presentation, hopefully, with stimulated discussion about the new domain of 3D printing, 3D replicas, and the role of 3D models in cultural heritage, which is actually already a controversial research field for several issues we will discuss shortly. Let me start with a statement actually from Charles Cronin. So the free scan and print technology holds the potential to undermine the value places on original cultural artifact based upon rarity and aura. This technology will eventually enable the creation of digital and physical copies that are undistinguishable from the original. They can cover public domain works whose intellectual values are being confined in a physical object. Is that true or completely true? So what happens in this field? Well, I want to start with smartphone because this is a projection of the smartphone user in the next few years. You see, we're over 2 billion in 2019. Well, I think we already all agree that the smartphone is everything but calling and phoning. Actually, it's everything. And actually, smartphones already are able to capture the world in 3D, but in the future will be basically sensor. You might know already the Google Tango project with the 3D smartphone a prototype produced in Zurich from the ETH. And actually, this smartphone is already a small optical scanner. Well, it's not maybe new in terms of technology, but it's impressive in terms of digital production. So what I want to show to the audience is that we, in my field, but in general in the digital production, we are in a completely different era. And this is something you can get online in several websites. So 2.5 quintillion bytes of data produce 90% of that produced in the last 2 years. And this is growing. It's growing, it's growing. So the digital production every day is a challenge. It's not just about global south, it's global. And of course, it's global as an impact in different communities, as different nations, as in different domains. But cultural heritage is actually put questions on identity, cultural transmission, colonization, post-colonization, and the like. Well, let's start with some digital challenges. For example, massive and distributed virtual reality system, augmented worlds. One day we will not be able to distinguish real and digital. 3D replicas in terms of 3D prints and also 3D models as well, and 3D archiving. This, of course, involves a massive engagement. So it's not anymore a research field, it's something else. So it involves a large community. It involves museums, and that's why I'd like to quote some of the museums, at least in the United States, starting to think about. And one of the first was the Getty Museum. You go to the website, you can read 3D scanning using handheld cameras, permitting the permanent collection gallery subject to the same condition described above. Well, we can discuss maybe later about copyright, copyleft, and the like, because this is another very complicated, very controversial discussion when we use a 3D model instead of simple photos. But this is something museums are dealing with. This is the Getty. Maybe you know already the Smithsonian has put part of the collection in 3D online, thanks to a collaboration with Autodesk. And some other, let's say, additional discussion about the development of digital worlds, transformation, I would say, digital in the last 20 years. I want to compare, for example, the language used in the 90s and what it's used now. So we're in the 90s, so the computer graphics or the digital rendering was actually based on very basic interaction. Now we use feedback, behaviors, digital behaviors embodiment, very sophisticated interaction, including artificial intelligence, robots, and so on. We had passive users, now we have content providers, model engagement, user engagement, and so on. We can continue. Most of it is digital to digital. So we catch already a lot of information in digital, what we transform to digital. And models actually are dense of information, and they float in the cyberspace. Sketchfab, for example, has millions of users, is a 3D community of 3D models of everything. And this is growing. It's a commercial initiative. That's something we have to discuss maybe again later, commercial versus nonprofit versus NGO and so on. We have a lot of virtual communities. Social media is changing completely the way we share, we distribute, and we control or maybe not control this information. What we are doing in terms of research, the communities I'm part with are producer as well. We produce virtual museum, so this is not in opposition to museum, but are part of the new collection where the digital artifact is a new artifact. Look, it's not a copy, it's a new artifact, it's a new art object. This is something we need to discuss now because it's different. It's not just about copying and paste, it's something else. It's a new ontology. A new ontology requires different research questions. We have to deal with what they call frameless reality. This is HoloLens, but we use a lot of other tools in virtual reality. We use massive reality. You see Mr. Zuckerberg here. We have Plane. We have a lot of Oculus Rift. Maybe you know the history of Oculus Rift, invented by a 23-year guy, and now it's part of the social media after Facebook decided to buy it. So it means that this is part of a social revolution. It's not anymore an individual research project or lab experiment. It's something else. In my field, very little, maybe very marginal in this big revolution, but maybe it's able to give a sense to these numbers. I'm again, archaeology, I'm also a digger, so I go to the field. This is my project in Italy, Volci, and you see the difference between the production of photos and 3D models in a few years, 2014, 2016. So every year we produce over 5 terabytes of data, over 40,000 photos, plus what the student produce and distribute in social media. So it's growing. It's impressive to me if you compare what we produced in the past, just paperwork or more or less. And this is completely digitally born. So there's no mediation from digital to digital. This is a question I have every day in my work. Are 3D models, 3D print just replicas or something else? Or it depends. Well, let's see what we're talking about. China in the early 2000s. So we started a project here in Xi'an, recording digitally part of the collection, West and Han. Actually, there are over 400,000 objects in the museum storage. So you have an idea of what is underwater, actually, it was saying, or underground in this case. And all these objects are now 3D models. This activity was actually started when I was teaching at UC Merced here in California. I have to say, unfortunately, UC didn't help me to save this archive, so this archive was shut down in one day, and because that happens when faculty move, there are no infrastructure in almost every university in the States able to save this, so unless you take care of the repository. This is a big problem because we produce a lot of digital, but this digital is not accessible. We have to deal also with other kind of 3D replicas. This is an hologram projected, you see, in a case. This is an exhibition, actually. So in exhibition, this case can produce 1,000 or 100,000 objects in a cycle of 3 seconds. Every single object you see, they look very realistic or photorealistic. I made this the first exhibition in Berkeley, actually, a few years ago. I've seen that many kids were shaking the case because they're thinking there was something inside, but it was a simple projection. So in terms of perception, they had the idea that the object was there, but it wasn't, at least the physical object. See here one of our visitors, for example. In terms of architectural models, because maybe we are typically focused on single object finds, for example, relatively small object, but there are also other situations. This is the Westerham tomb with outstanding mural paintings dated in the late 1st century BCE in Xi'an. It doesn't exist anymore. So it was recorded by Eliza Gardner. You see here, I'm inside with one of my students at the time. We recorded, we have the model, but the physical entity, the architecture of the tomb is gone. And this is the 3D model. So it looks, like a picture, but it's not. It's just a virtual model. I work also in Turkey at Çatalhöyük, and it's a Neolithic village in the central Anatolia. And this is another interesting example of a human mandible. No, I don't know. Did I make something wrong? No.
We've lost the slides for...
Okay.
You probably violated some copyright.
Yeah, exactly. I think
Crash the system.
No, I think, we discussed before about, some restriction when you show some sensitive, let's say, models and so on.
Body part.
Yeah, but this body part is, sorry, I can't see it here, but not here.
We all tune into the live stream. I think we can get the slide.
The digital.
Yeah, maybe, it's off. I think it's off, yeah, or maybe it doesn't like me. Yeah, it's coming back. Yeah. Well, in the meantime, I hope that it's fixable because my presentation is very visual. As you can't see, honestly, it's a problem. We can switch the screen, exactly. But it's important that the fact that that it's a human mandible, and it's actually covered with red plaster and red ochre and white plaster. Sorry. So it's a kind of artistic object made by a human component. Of the cranium. It's important because it's forbidden to export this kind of objects, part of human skeletons and ancient DNA from Turkey. So it's completely forbidden. It's also forbidden to export several objects unless you have a permit for an exhibition. In this specific case, so we made a 3D replica of the mandible in order to allow anthropologists in the States and UK and in France to study this kind of artifact. So digitally and using.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a heads up. The system is going to go down for a second, so your microphone is going to be cut.
Okay.
Will this one work?
No, I think
The whole system turns off and turns on the amplifier.
Sorry, everybody.
Well, we'll just wait for that.
Well, we can have a conversation. It's just, we're we're now off the record. Say everything.
Say secrets.
Yeah, I can take questions. I don't know.
Audio should be back.
Okay. Try the audio. Did you say the audio is back?
It should be, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, or in terms of I think you can hear me, as I can entertain you for the case of the mandible, because it's not just it's also a cultural and problem, I think, and political for Turkey. And again, I discussed with very few of you during the break. Because according to the Turkish government, this site is Turkish. And this is Erdogan's statement. It's not something coming from unknown sources. So that because it's part of the propaganda to say that this site is the first city of the world and should be Turkish. You can understand from the anthropological, ecological point of view, it doesn't make any sense. Turkey doesn't exist in the Neolithic time. And this guy, or this lady, actually was not Turkish at all. Genetically speaking, maybe was coming from Central Asia. We have a marker, genetic marker for showing their migration from different part from a different part of Central Asia to Central Anatolia and Eastern Asia and Central Anatolia. So this is an example of the fact that the object itself has a different cultural value and political value according to the research point of view and from other point of view. And the 3D model is actually one of the way we can continue the digital again, and the 3D replica, we can continue for continuing to study the artifact in many ways. And it's not the same because there are several details that we can see in the simulation of the object which are actually different from the empirical evidence. We call this a mediated experience. I will show in another slides what I think in terms of mediated experience, because it's able to convey a different kind of information, different kind of details, a different kind of it's coming? No. Yes, maybe.
Would it make sense to flip this?
Yeah,
around, or it's too
sure. I mean, whatever it's useful for you guys, and okay, do you see the, I can't, there's the model 3D print right now? Yep. Okay, so, okay. This is the 3D print of, this was made by one of my ex-students at that time, which is a very detailed, now there are several kind of, say, professional 3D printer able to generate a very, very accurate model. This is very important for scientific purposes, so it's not just a replica, but it's extremely accurate, range of microns, so several times. Let's continue with another project concerning, again, massive 3D models and 3D replicas as well. Maybe I can move here. Can you hear me if I stay here? Yes. So for the recording,
Well, here, we can give you a microphone.
Okay. Because it's better if I stay here. So.
Oh, the battery's dead on this one.
It must be that time of day.
I don't know what they have done. Thank you. Oh, sorry for that. Well, here we are in Rome, and so that this excavation in the 30s, and there are over 14,000 architectural fragments unclassified or some of them are classifiable, most of them not really. They're coming from the Basilica Ulpia, and they are in the museum storage in a very bad condition, or at least in a very difficult situation. So this project, for example, is based on a 3D puzzling of most of them, not all of them, because we don't have time now for finishing the work, but for the recomposition of the architectural decoration of the Basilica Ulpia. Here the Colosseum, here the Basilica Ulpia, and this then was called the so-called Museum of Treasures Market. So you have an idea of the location. So we're doing here, and so you see another way to use 3D models and digital and printed in several ways. In this case, we have the 3D plastic of the basilica. We have 6 holograms of the basilica, actually able to reproject the basilica from different point of view. In other terms, if you turn around the hologram, you have a different perspective. You can actually see through the ceiling of the basilica itself. And as well, you see the plastic in 3D. This is the case of architectural, important architectural decoration and important building which do not exist anymore. In this, for example, it looks like a 3D replica, but it's actually an hologram. I include other entities because if we just split the question and also the description in 3D replicas, 3D print, and 3D models, actually we do not include other simulations, other ways where we can convey, we can represent three-dimensionally the information. This is important in terms of feedback. So in other terms, the perceptual effect of this is different. So in other terms, we learn differently according to the visual representation of the object in different dimensions, okay? This is one of the view of the museum where the real objects are. So this is one of the challenges. So trying to help the visitor to recontextualize the collection in the 3D puzzle. And that's why the role of the replicas and of the digital simulation as well. For example, this is the anamorphic reconstruction of part of the fragment, and you see, or maybe some of you can see here, there is a panel engraved where we can see, it's called the freeze of weapons in 3 dimension. And then we can actually here recontextualize the fragments into the space. And that's why we can get the sense of the freeze, and we have a different kind of narrative representation at that point. We have also 3D replicas for interaction between real and digital environment. This is something we are experimenting. So you can play with 3D models in your hands, so that's what we call haptic devices. But at the same time, you see the result of your interaction into the 3D world. In other terms, for example, I could project myself in a 3D space. I can see a temple in printed here, or a 3D object here, and as well in the cyberspace. This is a kind of empirical, non-empirical evidence of the simulation. One more example is this is one of the most beautiful sculpture preserved in that museum of the Emperor Trajan. See, this is a fragment. This is actually something we can do even with a smartphone. So you shoot on site like that, which is, it seems right now just a picture, but you transform a picture in a point cloud really in a very short time, and then you include the texture, and then you have the 3D model of the head of the emperor, then the meshed model, and finally the reconstruction made by a digital artist. At the end, you have this, which is an app at the end. So the difference between the original and this is actually in the recontextualization of the fragment of the sculpture, and actually the new potential shown by that simulation. This is the case of the hologram of the fragments of the architectural fragments of the facade of the Basilica Ulpia and the reconstruction of the model, which is actually important in terms of ethical and scientific questions, because we can have different reconstruction, not just one. So one of the problems in this field is how can you validate that? How can you certify this for a public audience? One, it's a public. I would say I agree. I like the idea of public domain. So there is an additional problems. How can share this? How can make this accessible? And of course, if you can see the same model through Oculus Rift, through their website, through a 3D print, through a 3D virtual reality system, through an immersive cave, we have 6-sided cave at Duke University, and so on. So here, my slide over the mediated experience. So what I call mediated experience is because we use some devices in order to analyze or represent the reality. For example, again, smartphone, laser scanners, 3D H-mounted display, and so on. There's a new digital narrative. There's augmented reality because it includes more information. Several of these devices can allow to distinguish the reality and the graphic component. And in the other term, there's a new digital fabrication of heritage. I call this digital fabrication because it's something else. And this has a huge impact in terms of ethics, social value, political and national identity, and more. Because at the end, we thought in the past, that's why museums have had and still have a role, but they have a lot of concern because they don't have full control even of this part of heritage, which has, again, which put new questions about copyright or non-copyright, and so on. I like to, sorry that you can maybe read here, but I like to call this new world hyper-real. I use the concept of hyper-reality of French philosopher François Baudrillard, where we are in the real more than real. So, and in that sense, all this kind of technology increases somehow the value of the information, but not necessarily can demonstrate that are the same thing. That's why there is something else. And in this world, this transformation is completely changing also the tangible and intangible value of cultural heritage. So in other terms, what we, even before we discussed the UNESCO standard, actually are not here sufficient to describe this phenomenology because it's different. It's completely different. With pros and cons that we'll see at the very end. I'm going to finish here. I don't think we're going to see slides in the projector. But the role of cyber community and new media, social media, and so on can actually change the state of the art in this field and put new questions. So in this slide, and I will leave the presentation, so in any case you cannot see today, but you could maybe see from, can download it maybe after. And pros and cons or issues and potential maybe in terms of digital problems and digital modeling. Well, first of all, authenticity versus dissemination. So what is authentic now? After the empirical evidence, we think based on the existence of objects, that physical existence of objects. And the dissemination is, well, yeah, we don't have maybe control on the authenticity, but we can disseminate this forever, for generations, to millions of people, and so on. Copyright, well, that's a very controversial issue. I see that, for example, for the Getty, the copyright is mostly on the commercial use of some of the 3D print or 3D model, but then we need to open them, to open the archive. In order to make this information accessible, well, we need new infrastructure, because what we have is completely insufficient. Let's see, think about the libraries. I know there are several people here working in the libraries. How do you envision the library in the next 20 years? We know already that all our students, at least in the United States, want everything digital. It can be a PDF, can be an electronic access, but it's already there. And this is just for text. What about we share what we have now in terms of digital models and the like, digital environments? It's a massive, it might have a massive impact on digital archiving, on the role of the libraries in the future, right? So there are a lot of discussion, a lot of concern, but that's something I'd like to put now as a question. I do actually, to my library at least, but there are no solutions, just the fact that, oh, it will cost a lot maybe, and what shall we provide to the new users? So the library is not just a provider of books or readings, it will become something else. Ethical issues, of course, because then when we distribute massively all this content, we don't know maybe where does it come from. So who is able to validate that? Shall we validate this, or we just accept the fact that it's free to circulate and then we get it? Well, this also might be here another ethical problem is that, well, there are countries able to produce more and to have more power in that, and other countries cannot. And, well, in anthropological terms, I see a sort of risk in the digital colonization of the world. You can say, well, this is what we do, what we provide. Well, Google is doing something like that. They have a copyright of several digital artifacts worldwide from museums and so on. What about one day there is one corporation taking everything online, right? It's possible, in theory. The content validation versus public engagement. So you can say, well, I don't like to share it because I need to validate that because I have my expertise, my scholars, my team, my management. But then on the opposite, we say, well, no, we want the public engagement. We want this public without any control. Well, how can we manage this? Manipulation versus cultural transmission. So, of course, when it's digital, you can do everything. You can reconstruct, you can change, you can make fakes, a lot of fakes. And this, of course, in the world of billions of smartphone, in the new world of quintillion of bytes, well, there's an impact, right? Technological colonization versus learning experience. You know, that, of course, then the more I use my technology, the more maybe I have the power to control it or to disseminate that. Museum industrialization, because then museum maybe will change their mission somehow, and the problem of lost heritage. Well, I'm discussing this, we are all discussing this problem in the Middle East conflict, for example. We have a data set from Syria, we have data set from Egypt, we have data set from Turkey in some areas where we cannot go now, and so on. So this part from Iraq, I work a lot for that. A lot of data set, in theory, available for studying and for 3D modeling as well. So this is part of what is lost but can be digitally reconstructed. And finally, the accuracy and the risk of bad replicas as well. So we can make 3D models, but once we don't know the metadata, for example, associated with that digital object, it's just a digital entity. And you can label that as you like, or you can just accept that it's there. It's maybe in Sketchfab, it's in other repository. It's be okay. But there's no information how was catched and so on. And that is a proliferation of NGOs or new companies in this field worldwide. So they're growing. It's growing. Sorry, I was trying to entertain because I was hoping to show the slides, but I quit here my presentation. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much. We're over time, but I think we can take a couple questions.
If we're down to one microphone, so if we see what we can have.
Come back here.
We have. Okay. Here we go.
Oh, this is weird to say myself.
This question is for Aaron. So in my work, I'm forced to think about repatriation not as a resignification of the return, but as its destruction, genetic samples. So in one of the titles of your articles, you mentioned the concept of reciprocity. And I'm interested to hear just a little bit about it.
Sure. Is that loud enough, or do I need a mic? Please use the mic. Will this mic will work? I didn't realize. I thought they were off. That was actually, I considered doing that as my talk today, direct riff, and a few other people have brought this idea up. Maybe most powerfully our keynote this morning, which is the idea that there's still a kind of patronizing of traditional knowledge, indigenous culture, the modernity of these folks, right? And that's beginning to shift away in favor of a view that maybe their science has value for us as a species, us as a world, not just us, as science or academia or, the global north. This is, one could go into a lot of angles about this. The most obvious is the ecological, movement where we're telling Brazilians, don't cut down your forest because the whole world will die. And they say, well, you cut down on your forest 100 years ago and got rich. And now you're telling us don't cut down our forests, right? That kind of logic, the sort of discovery of these, in a non-patronizing way of, hey, maybe there's accumulated wisdom that has not just a value that we attach, out of reparation or sympathy or sorrow or regret or guilt or the other emotions that animate a whole lot of good things. I don't mean those are good things to feel, all of those things. So a big piece of my work in Alaska has involved trying to elucidate the Inupiaq Eskimo, which is their term of ethnonymic for Canadians who don't know. In Alaska, Eskimo is an accepted ethnonymic term for Inupiaqs. Their cultural system of exchange and ownership of things like songs and dances. And that's a proliferating model now. A lot of scholars, my colleague Robin Gray, whom I mentioned, who's a Tsimshian anthropologist, and I have worked collaboratively on a similar project with Tsimshian to say, okay, what's their intellectual property law, essentially? Although, and especially because this attaches, and this goes back to the keynote, this attaches to sovereignty. This attaches to the idea that this isn't a detachable issue of just songs and dances or texts or ideas, but ultimately the power to control access, circulation, and interpretation of one's expressive culture relies on territorial sovereignty. And so both many Inupiaq people and many Tsimshian people say we're on unceded territory. We're still sovereign. We assert that when these songs were collected in our territory, our law was sovereign, governed the interaction that produced them. And here's what our law says. And the basic thing Inupiaq law says is, you can take anything from me. I will share everything I said there, the original open source culture. I will share everything, my last bite of food with you. In fact, that's the most symbolic thing to do, is to share your food. With the expectation that it binds us in a social relation of mutual obligation for the future. So my book on this Bolton stuff deals extensively with how indigenous musicians would have understood what they were doing when they recorded for Laura Bolton. And my argument is that the Inupiaq whalers who sang and danced for her in 1946 understood, very willingly gave their songs to this woman with the expectation that it would accumulate value in a circulatory process, and the value would be the proof of the pudding of the logic of sharing it. And so there's a very pragmatic thing that, and same thing with the rapper, as I work with, who sample traditional music. A lot of the elders originally, I don't know about that, breaking songs up into beats and things like this. Once it starts to succeed and draw young people into speaking the language and so forth, they evaluate and say, okay, you did something with the thing that you took, and that thing redounded to the community's credit. So I basically elaborate that idea and think, what if we thought about the archive, really science, in these terms as entering into permanent relationships with the communities and the ecosystems we work with.
More questions, though.
Hi, this is kind of a follow-up question in a sense. What potential, if any, do you see in digital technologies for kind of promoting or kind of critiquing dominant ontologies of the archive, and or circulation? I'm thinking about kind of the work of the Mukurtu initiative, which
I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah, which seems to kind of allow for digital technology to promote kind of subtle practices of circulation and restricted circulation.
Really broad, short answer to that is that as a linguist, I actually see the fundamental issue here, the contest between oral and literate ontologies of the real. And that's why recording is such a fascinating thing to me, and that it initiates a schizophonic break. Only 110 or so years ago, it's really recent in human history that the sound of music did not mean sentient, conscious, intending beings in your immediate presence doing something organized. We're not evolved for recorded sound or projected images or virtual spaces yet, or we haven't. Maybe the genomics guys can hurry us up, but we haven't caught up in terms of sensing, feeling, socializing beings with that. I don't know. I mean, I'm a hacker from way back. I'm 53 years old. I started writing computer code in 1980. I bought Apple in 1991. I work a lot with platforms like Mukurtu and Islandora, and I'm really interested in the technological discourse around this stuff. But my experience of this many years around computing and technology is A, that we have no idea where it's going. It's complicated, obviously, and B, that there's a tendency to attach utopian discourses to very transient developments that turn out to bite us very often, very quickly. And little things like format migration, and in big things like, how we store metadata and what we consider appropriate metadata. So it doesn't really help to say that. Basically, I'm saying I have no idea. That's the bottom line. But I do think digeracy, if you term some people use to talk about a kind of emerging relationship to experience that digital technology is mediating. I'm a father of a teenage kid, so I watch native digeracy, which I don't possess even as someone who started coding in my teens. In my child's generation, and something's going on. And I see that same kind of mastery of the digital going on in the indigenous communities I work, a real fluency with a kind of mapping of traditional ideas of representation onto digital techniques. I have a friend who's a rapper from Detroit named Sacramento Knox, Knox with two X's on the end. He's Christopher Yepes, but he performs as Sacramento Knox. He talks about, he's Anishinaabe, he talks about how sampling, sound sampling, little bits of sounds that you then rearrange in a sequencer, just like with genomics. So the whole idea of digital breakdown, he says, well, my grandma did with that when she made beadwork. And so he draws a genealogy to sampling to Anishinaabe beadwork. Which itself is a kind of colonial encounter technology where it's not like that's in the midst of ancient tradition. That's in the history of the colonial encounter on its own too. But those kinds of metaphors are really interesting me right now, the ways that young indigenous artists are oralizing the digital, if you will, or claiming the digital for an oral phenomenology and ontology of experience. Sorry to go on at length.
seems like you could address that question in a similar frame.
Yeah, there's a, sorry, yeah. Well, I think there's a kind of infrastructural problem in general, so that, I mean, this question can be related with almost everything. And then, so to me, there is a desperate need of new infrastructures that we don't have yet. And I don't see also new consortium or whatever, a federal initiative, for example, in that domain. And I'm very worried, not because I'm so selfish that I want this now and well done, but it's because it will cost too much if you wait. So I think we have an estimate, so then even with our little world in our university, if we wait 10 years, we can spend at least 1,000 times the cost we can support today. And that's because then, you know, everything is implemented now. I mean, talking about the complexity of what we have discussed. So as a cost, not just of archiving, but implementation. So we have to prepare the models and so on for a platform. But then if we wait too much, then what we think now it's a standard, it's not anymore. It's it's kind of archaeodigital, right? And well, we know that. I mean, for 3D, we know that OBJ was kind of standard. OPLY is invented by Stanford some time ago. So it's pretty standard, but it has 18 years of life. A doc file, for example, made in the 90s is not readable anymore, at least from Microsoft Office, and so on. This is basic stuff, but the problem is serious because if we think that the human knowledge is actually true over the digital, well, we should be able to control that, or we should transmit to the future. That's a big problem. I mean, all our labs are able to share, I think, less than 1% of what we digitally produce. I don't think about my lab in archaeology, which is maybe very marginal, but I'm thinking in general, biotechnology or School of Medicine, for example, and so on. So there's a very little accessible and shareable. Most of it for technical problems, not because we want to keep this information, I know, secret or hidden. It's just the fact that it's not shared. So it's a big problem. If you think, I remind myself, the Library of Alexander of Egypt was the first globalized attempt to have the human knowledge in one place. Fire destroyed that. The Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. had the same utopian idea. Well, see, so if you compare the knowledge right there and the digital knowledge available online. So this is something we should be take care. We should be able to take care.
I think we should wrap this up and continue our conversation over lunch, but I really want to thank the panelists and you for your great questions.